So let's go to Buenos Aires, where Jane Dutton is.
A faltering economy with rising interest rates hits people where they feel it the most, in their pocket, and impacts on their day-to-day living. How do you prepare for the unexpected when you don't even know what your currency is going to be tomorrow? To help me discuss this and work out a way forward for Argentina and South Africa is economist Miguel Boggiano. Very good to have you with us. How do Argentinians survive this volatile economy? What do they need to focus on?
Well, I would say we have a huge history, a long history of volatility. So in many senses, people are already trained. But there's no good answer in the sense that you need to adapt every day, and it's inflation is actually a problem that is a consequence of the volatile economy, of the insecure exchange rate, instability of the exchange rate, and basically from the fact that politicians have for the last, I would say, 70 years done was not convenient to be done in terms of spending way more than what they collect. So all the difference ends up being supplied by printed money, right? So when you continue printing money because you spend more than what you can collect from taxes, you get the situation of a country like Argentina that continues struggling in terms of things that are no longer a problem in the rest of the world.
And printing money, I mean, that's a big warning signal, isn't it, to locals and foreign investors?
Absolutely. Locals, well, I would say we have like a very fine radar for detecting each time that the government will have problems. So the expectations of inflation are really, really fast because it's really hard to trick people, you know. When you print money and nobody is aware of that, you can trick them for a while. But if you have already pulled that trick so many times, people are already aware of that. So,
but if that trick fails, why is it a trick that the governments keep going back to?
Well, that's a very good question, but that's part of our latest history of, I would say, 40, 50 years in which we continue having the very same problems. If you read the newspapers today, and if you read the newspapers from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you will be astonished to realize that we're talking about the exact same problems. We're completely stuck.
Okay, so you say that people suffering the consequences of these policies constantly adapt. How do they adapt? I mean, if you don't know what the currency is going to be worth tomorrow, if you don't know what the inflation rate is going to be, how do you protect yourself?
Well, you don't have many ways of doing that. But I would say, for example, that people who can save money, which are very few in this country, honestly, what they do in terms of investments, for example, they pretend to guard themselves with real estate. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but they're not planning in making any progress with their savings. They're just trying not to lose money, right? Or sometimes when you have a context of very high inflation, you start buying goods, you start buying stuff, because you know that at least those things, that stuff will be worth something in the future.
And those who can afford it, I mean, is there a capital outflow from the country? Does it, you know, are the UK, US bank accounts increasingly attractive for those who've got money here?
Absolutely, Switzerland as well. So,
and that clearly doesn't help.
The government, the state is has predatory practices in terms of the extremely high taxes that we now have. So there's a lot of evasion as well. There's a lot of tax evasion, sometimes because that's the only way for some small companies to survive, right?
But what went wrong? 3 years ago, the IMF loans have been paid off. Inflation, unemployment was 6%. It's now 9%. Macri promised zero poverty. Now he's gone to the IMF with his begging bowl. What happened?
Well, to be honest, I would say the last government, it was 12 years in power. And all the numbers that you were seeing in terms of employment were true, but at the same time were the consequence of the government hiring everybody that was not able to get a job and to put it to work for the government. So if you take a look at the size of the government as a proportion of the GDP, when Nestor Kirchner started his government in 2003, government spending over GDP was 24%. When Christina Kirchner left, government spending over GDP was 44%. So they actually doubled the size of the government.
But people had jobs.
Well, it's not that people have jobs, it's that you have to continue taxing everybody else for them to keep them in the government. But so the private sector got completely, had such a burden of these high taxes that now it's really hard for the private sector to generate employment of quality and that actually has a use in the economy. So there's a lot of people working for the state that actually don't produce anything. And that is a huge problem. I would say that's probably a good summary of what was going on in the last 15 years. Instead of tackling the problems in the right way, generating growth, well, you just sweep them below the carpet.
Okay, can I read a tweet to you? You say, I wish a worse crisis than 2001 so Argentina can reduce the state, taxes and unions. I mean, sort of paraphrasing you here, you sort of said, whatever cost.
Well,
isn't that a bit radical? I mean, why would you?
It is. What I was meaning, and obviously that was a time when Twitter was even 140 characters to express an idea. It's obvious that I don't want any crisis or bad time for no one, but our history tells us that you only do what you have to do when there's no other alternative, and that was the spirit of that tweet, right? To finally get to a point in which politicians will have to do the right thing just because there's no alternative.
But that's what it seems to be happening, what you are advocating there, the reduction of the state, the targeting of unions. I mean, is that the way forward? And where does it leave Argentinians and their rights?
It doesn't look like so much at this point, I would say. But, for example, now that the government has to go to the IMF, well, they end up finally trying to get to fight fiscal deficit. But that's just something that needs to be done. But if you don't have the proper reforms, there's no way the country will be able to grow again.
So, I mean, what lessons do you learn from this? And, for example, what could South Africa, who's also facing its own, economic nightmare, fiscal cliff, what can South Africa learn from the mistakes made by Argentina in order not to do the same?
It's really hard to learn from a country who's making the mistakes over and over again.
But surely it should be telling you what not to do. I mean, can you walk away and say, right, we should stop?
Well, I would say
raising inflation.
I would say that
pushing up taxes.
It's a global trend. It has been a global trend for the last 20 years, probably, to have the size of a state to grow. But now, for example, here in Argentina, everybody likes to to talk about Scandinavian countries, and they claim they have a big state, they have high taxes, and still they have a high quality of life. But if you take a look at them, they're now taking taxes down, and that's what's also happening in many countries of Europe that have been stagnating for the last 10, 15 years. And the problem is that sometimes you make comparisons that are not valid, because even those countries that have European and Scandinavian countries that have high taxes and good quality of life have way more economic freedom than countries like Argentina. So if you take a look at the size of the trade as a percentage of GDP, Argentina, it's not an open economy. And that's not the same claim that you could do from Scandinavia or Europe. Those are very open economies. But still, with their openness, they have realized that they have to reduce taxes. And there's a global competition in terms of taxes. The US, it's become a great participant in that competition, with Trump reducing taxes at such an aggressive pace. So I think most countries of the world will now be facing the pressure of some other countries taking taxes down, and that's a competition towards trying to, seduce investments globally.
Okay, might tariffs, the tariff war that's happening, the trade war that's happening, might that benefit emerging economies in a sense that they could fill gaps?
It's hard to tell, I think, so far.
For example, your agriculture market and your soy market, for example, you'd be...
Well, we have, for example...
climbing in there.
It's a good question that you're posing, because, for example, we have restrictions to enter a market like the US or Europe in terms of our agricultural products. So, in many ways, globalization, it's a good idea, but then what Trump is doing, and to some extent China, it's in Europe, probably I would say the world, it's maybe going back on its own paces in terms of saying, okay, we thought we liked globalization, but now that imposes a high cost in some countries. For example, in the US, what Trump has been proposing has to do with many anti-globalization ideas. Why? Well, if you remember, Make America Great Again pretends to bring jobs back to the US that were taken abroad for reasons as it was cheaper to make them abroad. So now it's becoming, and this tariff war, in the end, it's like a war against globalization.
Okay, and then the message for South Africa is not to look in this direction, but to look somewhere else if they want to pull themselves out of the doldrums.
Probably, I would say the message is, if you really want to help people, you need to have the health of the private sector, who's the sector who can actually produce quality jobs and provide growth to the country, well, as free as possible to do things. Because otherwise you have the government or the state, depending on how you want to look at it, but competing for the resources, because taxes is like extracting resources from the private sector into like a redistribution of some own decision from the government, and that almost always makes harder for any country to grow.
And that's it from me, Jane Dutton in Buenos Aires. Time now to hand you back to my colleague Vuyo Mvoko in Johannesburg.